The millionaire CEO thought he left his past behind, until he saw twin girls wearing the ring he gave the only woman he ever loved. James Carter sat in the corner booth of the most exclusive restaurant in the city, the amber light from the chandelier above catching the edge of his whiskey glass. His dark hair, grown slightly long to the nape of his neck, framed a face marked by sharp cheekbones and piercing blue eyes that had seen countless victories in the business world. Around him, the quiet hum of luxury lived easily, crystal glasses clinking, laughter restrained to polite murmurs, the soft shuffle of waiters moving like shadows. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration. Another deal closed. Another hotel acquired. Another notch carved into the empire he had built with relentless ambition. And yet, as he swirled the whiskey in his glass, he felt nothing. No pride. No thrill. Just the familiar, hollow echo that success never seemed to fill. He was about to call for another drink when something outside the window caught his attention. Two little girls, standing near the fountain across the street, illuminated by the golden street lamps. At first, he thought he was imagining things, twin images moving together like reflections. They looked about 7 years old, with long, slightly wavy dark hair that caught the light as they turned their heads. They wore simple summer dresses that fluttered around their knees, and even from a distance, he could see the unmistakable shade of blue in their eyes, so startlingly bright they seemed to glow. James leaned forward slightly, drawn in by some instinct he didn't understand. That's when he saw it, a flash of silver on one of the girl's small hands. A ring. Simple, delicate, unmistakable. His heart stuttered painfully in his chest. It wasn't just any ring. It was the ring. The one he had given to Sarah all those years ago. A small silver band with a tiny, carved heart at its center. It had been a modest gift, almost laughably simple compared to the lavish jewelry he could have afforded, but Sarah had loved it more than anything. She had called it her forever promise, holding it close like it meant more to her than any treasure in the world. And now it was on the finger of a little girl who shared her eyes. James tossed a few large bills onto the table without waiting for the check, grabbed his jacket, and pushed through the heavy glass door into the thick, humid night. The noise of the restaurant faded behind him, replaced by the distant splash of the fountain and the soft buzz of the city winding down. He crossed the street without thinking, heart pounding harder with every step. The girls were still there, giggling quietly, oblivious to the way their world was about to change. As he approached, he noticed how their hands were intertwined, how they mirrored each other's movements unconsciously, a symmetry so natural it was breathtaking. He stopped a few feet away, unsure what to say, suddenly terrified that speaking would shatter the strange, fragile reality forming in front of him. "Hi," he said, his voice more uncertain than he intended. "Where's your mom?" Both girls turned to look at him, identical blue eyes wide and clear. One of them clutched a small stuffed bear to her chest. The other twisted the ring nervously on her finger, the tiny heart flashing in the light. "Mommy's at work," the bolder one said after a pause. "She said we could stay here for a little while." James crouched down to their level, his mind racing. He needed to know. Needed to be sure. But in his heart, he already was. The faces in front of him, the ring, the name that burned unspoken on his lips, it all collided into a single, undeniable truth. "Can you tell me your names?" he asked gently. "I'm Emily," said the first girl. "And she's Sophia." The names twisted like a knife into the center of his chest. He didn't ask anything else. He just sat down on the edge of the fountain, feeling the cool stone beneath his hands, and tried to breathe. He watched the girls laugh softly together, their entire world wrapped up in each other, and realized that everything he had ever thought was important, every hotel, every contract, every hollow victory, meant nothing compared to the lives standing right in front of him. And in that moment, James Carter, the untouchable millionaire CEO, felt his entire world tilt irrevocably towards something he hadn't even known he was missing. James stayed seated on the edge of the fountain, watching the girls in stunned silence. Every instinct in him screamed to act, to fix this, to somehow make sense of it, but he couldn't move. He had spent years building a life where control was his strongest weapon, where every problem had a strategy, every risk a calculated response. But sitting here, watching two small girls who unknowingly carried pieces of him, he realized that some moments weren't meant to be controlled. They were meant to be faced, no matter how unprepared he felt. The girls didn't seem afraid of him. In fact, they seemed strangely comfortable, almost as if on some unconscious level they recognized him too. Emily twirled a strand of her long hair around her finger while Sophia bent down to adjust the laces on her sandals, glancing up at him with casual curiosity. They didn't ask him who he was or why he was talking to them. It felt almost too natural, too easy, like a thread that had been quietly stitching itself into place long before he had noticed. A waiter from the restaurant came outside and glanced at the girls with a frown. James immediately rose to his feet, instinctively positioning himself between the girls and the stranger. The waiter, seeing the situation, merely shrugged and went back inside. James turned his attention back to the girls, crouching down again to their level. "Does your mom know you're here alone?" he asked gently, careful not to sound accusing. Sophia nodded, hugging the little bear closer to her chest. "She works just across the street," she said. "She can see us from the window." James looked toward the bakery on the corner and saw a small shop with its lights still on. He remembered Sarah mentioning once that she loved baking, though back then he hadn't listened carefully enough to keep all the details. Now those details came rushing back, each one hitting harder than the last. "And your mom's name, it's Sarah, right?" he asked carefully. Emily beamed. "Sarah Brooks," she said proudly, as if it was the most important fact in the world. James swallowed hard. The girls were hers. And there was no doubt anymore, they were his too. Every part of him screamed to go to Sarah immediately, to demand answers, but looking at the two small faces staring at him with such openness, he knew he couldn't make this about anger or betrayal. It had to be about them. He pulled out his phone and hesitated before dialing. Who would he even call? His assistant? His lawyer? None of them could help him in this moment. He needed to act not as a CEO, but as a father, a word that felt impossibly new and terrifying. "Would you like to come inside and have something to eat?" he asked, pointing back toward the restaurant. Sophia glanced at Emily, who gave a small, uncertain shrug. "We have to wait for Mommy," Emily said. She said not to go far. James thought quickly. He didn't want to scare them or break their trust. "We'll sit by the window," he promised. "You can still see her shop from there. And I'll stay with you." After a few seconds of whispered debate, the girls agreed. He led them inside, feeling the weight of 100 stares from the diners still lingering over their meals. In his world, everything had been polished, pristine, rehearsed. But this wasn't polished. It was messy and imperfect and absolutely real. He ordered ice cream for them and coffee for himself. They sat at a small table by the window, the girls swinging their legs under the chairs as they chattered between spoonfuls. James didn't interrupt. He just listened, soaking in every giggle, every tiny sentence, every glimpse into the lives he hadn't known he had missed. As they ate, he caught a glimpse of Sarah through the bakery window. She was working behind the counter, unaware that her world was about to change. Her hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and she looked tired, but still achingly beautiful. James stared, feeling 1,000 emotions crash over him at once, regret, longing, awe, and something deeper that he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years, hope. He knew he couldn't delay what had to happen next. He had to see her. He had to talk to her. He had to face the past he had so easily abandoned, and the future he could no longer imagine without them. James paid for the ice cream, leaving a generous tip on the table, and walked the girls back outside, keeping a careful watch over them as if they might somehow disappear if he looked away. The air was thick with the smell of rain that hadn't yet fallen, and the last rays of the setting sun cast long, dramatic shadows across the street. Emily and Sophia walked ahead of him a few steps, their hands swinging between them, completely at ease. For a moment, he just stood there, watching them, feeling a strange, almost painful pride fill his chest. Crossing the street with them felt like crossing a line he could never retreat from. Each step toward the bakery was another admission of everything he had missed, every moment he hadn't known to fight for. He wasn't sure what he would say to Sarah. He wasn't even sure if she would let him speak. But he knew he had to try. He owed her that much. He owed them that much. The small bell above the bakery door jingled as they entered. The warm, sweet scent of fresh bread and sugar filled the air, wrapping around him like a memory he hadn't realized he was carrying. Sarah stood behind the counter, wiping her hands on a towel, her back turned to them. She was talking to someone in the kitchen, her voice light but tired. James's heart hammered against his ribs. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. It was Sophia who broke the moment, running ahead and tugging at Sarah's apron. "Mommy, look who we found," she said brightly. Sarah turned, and the moment her eyes met James's, the whole room seemed to fall away. For a long beat, neither of them spoke. She just stared at him, the color draining from her face, the towel slipping from her hands. Her brown eyes, those same eyes that haunted his dreams more times than he cared to admit, were wide with shock, and something else. Fear. James stepped forward carefully, every movement deliberate, not wanting to scare her, not wanting to cause a scene. "Sarah," he said, his voice low, rough with everything he couldn't say all at once. "It's me." She opened her mouth, closed it, tried again. "What are you doing here?" she whispered. "I didn't know," he said, each word heavy and raw. "I didn't know about them." Sarah blinked rapidly, glancing down at the girls, who were now busy showing each other something they had found on the counter. For a moment, her face crumpled, and she had to look away. James waited, every instinct screaming to reach out, to pull her into his arms, but he forced himself to stay still. "I thought it was better this way," she said finally, her voice shaking. "You had your world, James. You were building something huge. I didn't want to ruin it." "You didn't ruin anything," he said, a rough laugh escaping him, half broken by emotion. "You gave me the only thing that matters." Tears filled her eyes, but she blinked them away fiercely. She wasn't the girl he had left behind. She was stronger now, forged by 7 years of single motherhood, by nights spent worrying alone, by a life she had built without him. And still, she was Sarah. His Sarah. The girls laughed over something silly, their bright voices cutting through the heavy silence. James followed Sarah's gaze as she looked at them, her face softening despite herself. "You should go," she said quietly. "You're not part of this life." "I am now," he said firmly, not leaving space for argument. "I don't want to miss another day." Sarah shook her head, but he saw the way her hands trembled, the way her shoulders sagged as if carrying a weight she had gotten too used to. "I'll prove it," James said, his voice gentler now. "Not with words. With time. With actions. I'm not asking for anything today. Just a chance." For a long moment, she just looked at him, like she was trying to see inside him, to measure the truth in his face. And then, finally, almost imperceptibly, she nodded. James let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't a promise. But it was a beginning. And for the first time in years, he felt like he had something worth fighting for, something real, something that wasn't measured in contracts or profits, but in laughter, in small hands holding his, in second chances earned the hard way. James spent the following days navigating a reality that felt both terrifying and sacred. He didn't push Sarah for more than she was ready to give. He didn't bombard her with questions about the past or try to force conversations about the future. Instead, he simply showed up. Every afternoon after he finished his meetings, he would walk into the bakery just before closing time, never asking if he was welcome but silently offering to help in whatever small way he could. At first, Sarah barely spoke to him beyond what was necessary. The following days unfolded with a fragile uncertainty that James hadn't experienced in years. Each morning he woke up wondering if Sarah would change her mind, if she would shut him out, if the tentative bridge between them would crumble under the weight of all the time and hurt they hadn't yet spoken about. But she didn't. She allowed him small moments, cautious invitations into the life she had built with Emily and Sophia. At first, it was simple things, a walk to the park, helping the girls pick out new books from the library, sitting together at a tiny, cluttered table in the bakery while the girls colored and Sarah worked. Every interaction felt like learning a new language, one based not on promises or declarations, but on presence, patience, and the willingness to stay even when it was uncomfortable. James showed up every day. He didn't come with grand gestures or expensive gifts. Instead, he came with steady hands to tie sneakers, with quick jokes to turn tears into giggles, with the quiet understanding that trust had to be earned, not demanded. He stayed late helping Sarah clean the bakery after hours, sometimes talking in low voices over the sound of dishes being stacked, other times just existing in the same space without forcing conversation. The air between them was heavy with everything unsaid, but also with the tentative hope that maybe it wasn't too late to start over. One evening, after the bakery closed and the girls were upstairs getting ready for bed, Sarah and James found themselves alone in the kitchen. She wiped down the counters while he leaned against the doorframe, watching her, wondering how he had ever let her slip away. Finally, he broke the silence. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice low but steady. Sarah didn't turn around immediately. She finished wiping a spot on the counter with deliberate care, then set the cloth down and rested her hands on the edge of the sink. When she finally faced him, there was no anger in her expression, only sadness. "I was scared," she said simply. "You made it clear back then that you had no room for anything outside your career. You were already halfway gone when I found out I was pregnant. I thought if I told you, it would either destroy your dreams or make you resent me. Or both. So I chose to disappear." James felt the words hit like a punch to the gut, not because he didn't understand them, but because deep down, he knew she was right. Back then, he would have seen fatherhood as a burden, not a gift. It shamed him to realize it, but it also made him more determined to be better now. "You were wrong about one thing," he said after a moment. "I could never have resented you. Not for them. Not for anything." Sarah gave a soft, broken laugh. "It's easy to say that now." James crossed the room slowly, giving her time to step away if she wanted, but she stayed where she was. When he reached her, he didn't touch her, just stood close enough for her to hear the sincerity in his voice. "I know I can't erase the past," he said. "But I'm not the man I was back then. I'm not running anymore. I want to be part of their lives. And yours, if you'll let me." Sarah's eyes filled with tears she didn't try to hide. She looked up at him for a long time, searching his face for any sign of weakness or doubt, and finding none. Finally, she nodded, the smallest of gestures, but it carried the weight of 7 years of separation. That night, James didn't stay for dinner. He left after hugging the girls goodnight, after Sarah gave him a shy, tentative smile that felt more valuable than any contract he had ever signed. He drove home through the quiet streets with the windows down, feeling the cool air on his face, feeling alive in a way he hadn't in years. He wasn't delusional. He knew there would be hard days ahead, moments of anger and sadness and mistrust to work through. But he also knew that for the first time in a very long time, he was exactly where he was meant to be. And he wasn't going anywhere. The weeks that followed moved slowly, marked by small victories and fragile steps toward rebuilding what had once been broken beyond recognition. James didn't force himself into Sarah's life or the girls' routines, he let them lead, stepping into their world on their terms. It was not easy for him to relinquish control, not after years of being the man who commanded boardrooms and set his own course without question. But here, in the simple, chaotic world Sarah had built, He had to earn his place not with authority but with consistency and care. Mornings became his favorite part of the day. Sometimes he arrived early enough to walk Emily and Sophia to their small school down the street, carrying their backpacks and holding their tiny hands as they chattered about their classmates and favorite games. Other days he would help Sarah open the bakery, setting out chairs and wiping down tables, pretending he knew what he was doing just to make her laugh. That laugh had become his favorite sound, rare and cautious at first, but slowly becoming more frequent, more genuine. It was like witnessing spring after a long winter. One rainy afternoon, when the bakery was quiet and the girls were upstairs drawing, Sarah and James sat at the little table by the window with 2 mugs of tea between them. Sarah watched the rain slide down the glass, her fingers wrapped around the warm mug, her expression thoughtful. James waited, sensing that she was working up the courage to say something important. Finally, she spoke. "They ask about you sometimes," she said without looking at him. "Even before they met you. They used to make up stories about who their father was. I didn't know what to tell them." James felt the weight of her words settle on his shoulders. He hated the idea that his daughters had grown up wondering, imagining, missing something that should have been theirs by right. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "You don't have to explain," he said quietly. "I'm the one who left. I didn't know about them, but I still made the choice that made all this harder for you." Sarah looked at him then, her eyes soft and sad. "I don't want them to be confused. I don't want to rush anything, but they deserve to know they have a father who loves them." James nodded, feeling a lump form in his throat. "They will know," he promised. "Not because I say it once, but because I show them every single day." After that conversation, things began to shift. Sarah let him stay for dinner more often, let him help with bedtime routines. James learned how each girl liked to be tucked in. Emily needed 2 kisses on the forehead, Sophia wanted a story, and then the lights left on just a little. It was in these tiny, sacred rituals that James found himself becoming not just a visitor, but a father. There were setbacks too. One evening, Sophia had a nightmare and called out for Mommy, not Daddy, and James felt a sting he hadn't expected. Another time, Emily got frustrated and shouted that he wasn't really part of the family. It broke his heart, but he didn't let it show. He understood. Love wasn't owed. Trust wasn't automatic. It had to be built, brick by patient brick, even if it took years. One Sunday afternoon, when the rain finally gave way to clear skies, they all went to the park. The girls ran ahead, chasing each other around the playground, while Sarah and James sat on a bench watching them. Without thinking, Sarah leaned her head lightly against his shoulder. James stayed perfectly still, afraid that moving might shatter the moment. "They're happy," Sarah said after a while, her voice barely above a whisper. James smiled, his heart full. "They have you," he said. "They have you now too," she said, and this time when he looked at her, there was no fear, no distance, only warmth and something deeper taking root between them. As the sun dipped lower in the sky and the laughter of the girls filled the air, James realized something simple and profound: this was his life now. Not the one he had chased for so many years, but the one that had been waiting for him to slow down long enough to see it. Not perfect. Not easy. But real. And he wasn't going to lose it again. Autumn arrived slowly, bringing with it cooler mornings and the scent of leaves drifting through the air. The city seemed to slow down, wrapped in soft gray skies and the golden haze of early sunsets. James had never paid much attention to seasons before. His life had always been divided by fiscal quarters, deadlines, meetings scheduled months in advance. But now he found himself marking time by simpler things: the way Emily's hair caught the afternoon light, how Sophia insisted on jumping into every pile of leaves they passed, how Sarah smiled more freely when she thought he wasn't looking. Every day felt like building something invisible but solid, something he could not quantify but could feel deep in his bones. He had moved into a small house just 2 streets away from Sarah and the girls. It was modest by his previous standards, but it felt like home in a way his penthouse never had. He painted the walls himself, bought a couch that was immediately covered in crayon marks, and filled the kitchen with mismatched mugs and cereal boxes. The girls loved having a second place to call home, and Sarah seemed relieved too, knowing that he was close but not overstepping. Their weekends became a ritual. Saturday mornings meant pancakes and cartoons, afternoons were for exploring parks or finding the best hot chocolate in town. On Sundays, they cooked dinner together, the girls helping as best they could, usually creating more mess than food but laughing the entire time. Sarah often sat back during these moments, watching James with an expression so full of emotion that it made his chest ache. One Saturday, they decided to carve pumpkins for the first time. The girls picked out the biggest pumpkins they could find, and they all sat in Sarah's tiny backyard with newspapers spread across the grass. James had no idea what he was doing, and his pumpkin turned out looking more confused than scary, but the girls declared it the winner anyway. Sophia proudly placed it on the porch and said it would keep all the bad dreams away. Sarah caught James's eye then, and for the first time, he saw it, unspoken forgiveness, a door that was finally opening wider. That night, after the girls had gone to bed and the house was wrapped in the soft quiet of sleep, Sarah and James sat outside under the stars. A thin blanket wrapped around both their shoulders, more out of comfort than necessity. Sarah sipped her tea and glanced at him sideways. "You're really not going anywhere, are you?" she said, her voice low and almost teasing. James shook his head, smiling. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Sarah set down her mug and turned to face him fully. There was no anger left between them, no heavy silence. Only the future, stretching out uncertain but full of possibility. "I'm scared," she admitted. "Of getting used to you being here. Of needing you." He reached for her hand without hesitation. "You're allowed to need me. I want you to." For a long moment they just sat like that, hands intertwined, breathing in the crisp night air. No promises were made, no grand declarations. But something shifted quietly, deeply. When James finally got up to leave, Sarah walked him to the gate. She lingered there as he stepped onto the sidewalk, neither of them quite wanting to break the moment. "Good night, Sarah," he said, and there was a warmth in his voice that only she had ever brought out of him. "Good night, James," she whispered back. As he walked home under the canopy of autumn stars, he realized that the life he was building with them wasn't just better than the one he had before. It was the life he had never dared to dream about because he hadn't believed he deserved it. Now he did. And he would spend the rest of his life proving it to them, and to himself, one day at a time. Winter crept in with a quiet gentleness, covering the city in soft layers of frost and painting the early mornings silver. James found himself cherishing the cold months in ways he never had before. The world slowed down even more, and with it, his own heart seemed to settle into a steady, grateful rhythm. The girls had taken to spending nearly every evening at his house, their backpacks and shoes scattered in the hallway, their giggles bouncing off the walls that had once echoed with silence. Emily and Sophia had claimed the spare bedroom, transforming it into a whirlwind of dolls, books, and colorful blankets. Sarah, too, began to relax into the life they were slowly weaving together, though she was careful not to rush anything, cautious not to let herself believe too easily that James was truly here to stay. James understood her fear better than he let on. There were still moments when he caught a flash of uncertainty in her eyes, when a simple hesitation in her voice would remind him that love, once broken, needed more than promises to heal. It needed time. It needed proof. So he continued to show up, not with flowers or declarations, but with small, consistent acts of love. He attended parent-teacher conferences without being asked, he learned the names of their favorite cartoons and sat through endless episodes without complaint. He shoveled the walkway to the bakery before Sarah could even unlock the front door on snowy mornings. One evening, just days before Christmas, they decided to decorate the small tree James had bought impulsively during a trip to the grocery store. It wasn't much, a little crooked, with sparse branches, but to the girls, it was magical. They spent hours stringing popcorn and cranberries, hanging handmade ornaments, and wrapping it with too many blinking lights. Sarah laughed more that night than James had heard in years, the sound filling the house with a kind of warmth that even the coldest winter wind couldn't touch. When the tree was finished, Emily insisted that James needed to put the star on top. He lifted Sophia onto his shoulders so she could place it herself, and as she leaned down to fit the star into place, James caught Sarah's gaze across the room. Something passed between them then, silent but sure, the understanding that they had built something real, something worth holding on to. Later, after the girls were tucked into bed, James and Sarah sat together on the couch, the only light coming from the glow of the tree. James took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything he wanted to say pressing against his chest. "I spent so long thinking I had everything," he said quietly. "Success, money, freedom. But it was all empty without anyone to share it with." Sarah didn't interrupt. She simply listened, her hand resting close to his, their fingers not quite touching. "You and the girls, you gave me a life I didn't even know how to hope for," he continued. "You gave me something real." Tears shimmered in Sarah's eyes, but she blinked them back. She reached for his hand then, twining her fingers with his in a gesture so natural it made his heart ache. "We built it together," she whispered. "You didn't just find us. You chose us." James squeezed her hand gently, overwhelmed by the truth of her words. For the first time, he wasn't running from anything. He wasn't chasing an empty dream. He was standing still, firmly rooted in a life that mattered. That night, as the snow began to fall softly outside, James realized that home wasn't a place or a title or a perfect plan. Home was where the people you loved waited for you, trusted you, needed you. Home was Sarah's quiet strength, Emily's unstoppable curiosity, Sophia's wild laughter. Home was this imperfect, beautiful family that had chosen him back. And he knew, with absolute certainty, that he would never leave again. Spring arrived with the softest touch, as if the world itself was waking up after a long and careful sleep. The streets began to warm, the bakery filled with the scent of fresh flowers mixed with baked bread, and the girls ran outside every chance they got, chasing each other in the growing sunlight. For James, it felt like breathing became easier, as if all the tight, locked places inside him had finally begun to open. His life with Sarah, Emily, and Sophia was no longer a question or a fragile dream. It was real, solid, something he could feel in every small, extraordinary moment that made up their days. James decided that it was time. Not for grand speeches or elaborate gestures, but for something true and simple, something that reflected the life they had built together. He spent weeks planning it in secret, with the girls helping in their own chaotic ways. Sophia kept almost spilling the surprise to Sarah every time they baked cookies or sat around the living room. Emily drew hundreds of little pictures trying to design the perfect invitation, even though James explained there would be no guests except them. On a warm Sunday afternoon, he led Sarah and the girls to the small park where he had first truly seen them, where fate had thrown their lives together again. The fountain was still there, its water glinting in the sun, and the old bench where he had first heard their names waited like an old friend. Sarah was laughing, teasing him for being so secretive, while the girls bounced with excitement at her sides. When they reached the fountain, James turned and knelt down in front of Sarah. He didn't pull out a fancy box or a grand diamond. Instead, he held up a simple silver ring, nearly identical to the one he had given her so many years ago, the one that had been worn on a little girl's finger and brought him back to her. This ring had a small heart too, but it was engraved inside with 4 initials, hers, his, and the 2 girls, forever woven together. Sarah gasped, her hands flying to her mouth as tears welled in her eyes. The girls clapped and jumped around them, shouting, "Say yes! Say yes," so loudly that a few people across the park turned to look. James kept his voice low, meant only for her. "You have always been my home, Sarah. I left once because I was too blind to see it. I will never make that mistake again. Will you marry me, not to change anything, but to celebrate everything we already are?" Sarah didn't hesitate. She nodded through her tears, laughing and crying all at once. She threw her arms around his neck and whispered, "Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes." The girls cheered even louder, and James pulled all of them into a hug, holding on as if he never planned to let go again. They stayed like that for a long time, wrapped in each other, the fountain murmuring behind them, the sun warm on their backs, the whole world feeling like it was finally in the right place. The wedding was small, held in the bakery after closing time, with the smell of fresh pastries filling the air and twinkle lights strung across the ceiling. Sarah wore a simple white dress, barefoot and glowing. Emily and Sophia served as flower girls, scattering petals with such enthusiasm that it took minutes to clear the aisle. James wore a suit that the girls had picked out, slightly too colorful for his old tastes but perfect for who he was now. When James looked into Sarah's eyes as they said their vows, he didn't think about the time they had lost. He thought about every moment they had chosen to stay, to forgive, to build. He thought about the little hands that had reached for him in trust, the small voices that had called him daddy without hesitation, the woman who had loved him enough to let him find his way back. As they kissed, the girls clapped wildly and someone knocked over a tray of pastries, but none of it mattered. They laughed until their sides hurt, danced until they couldn't stand, and loved with a kind of fearless joy that only comes after surviving heartbreak. James had once believed that success was measured in power, in wealth, in titles. But standing there, surrounded by the family he had almost missed, he realized that true success was something quieter and infinitely greater. It was a life built out of second chances, everyday promises, and love so steady it could outlast anything. And as the evening faded into soft music and warm light, James knew, without a single doubt, that he had finally found everything he had ever truly needed.